I think we have to view that within the context of all the other existential crises that we face, right? Like climate change, potential nuclear war, AI, all these things. The solution from our leaders for all of that is the police state.
Their solution is strengthen the police state, increase control, rule with an iron fist, and prepare for the worst by controlling the situation.
Exactly.
Which is why I think our work is so important to shine a light on a different path forward.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
And so that different path forward would look like actually a more abundant future. Welcome back to the Better Future podcast, bringing you the people, projects, and ideas helping steer the world toward a better future. I'm your host, Michael Mez, and my guest today is Raymond Wei. He's a filmmaker, community organizer, and co-founder of Conscious Citizens, a newsletter and online directory helping build collective consciousness and community power. I recently noticed Ray's videos on social media, and I was immediately impressed by his quality of communication around really difficult topics like geopolitics and activism and organizing for collective liberation in the face of rising authoritarianism. When I reached out to him, I was really happy to learn he lives not too far from me in Los Angeles. And I've been really grateful to have him as a member of my community during the recent wave of ICE raids sweeping through the city, where heavily armed, masked federal troopers have been rounding up immigrants and throwing them into the back of unmarked vans. It's been a scary time for sure, but a silver lining has been that I've gotten to see Ray in action, organizing to not only give people the support they need, but help them build collective power so that when this happens again, we'll be ready. And let's be honest, this will happen again. So I think Ray is the perfect guest to talk not only about where we're at right now, but what we can do about it and how we can build our community's resilience for the years ahead. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Let's get into it. So Ray, the vibes are kind of off right now.
A little bit.
Things don't seem to be going in the best of directions. Would you say?
Yeah, things are going a little sideways.
A little sideways.
Feels a little sideways, for sure.
But we're also being told that, like, this is normal, this is fine, and we have to kind of keep going to work every day and getting our groceries and acting like
life
everything
goes on, or supposed to go on, right?
Supposed to go on, yeah. You've talked about this notion of hypernormalization to describe what's happening now. So maybe we can start there just to ground ourselves in like the context of where we're at, because I think that's a really helpful idea.
Yeah, for sure. So hypernormalization was coined by a professor named Alexei Yurchak. He was a Soviet professor who grew up during the Soviet Union. It's a word that he coined to describe what it was like to live through the end of the Soviet Union. Throughout the 90s, throughout the 80s and 90s. And what he described was this feeling of the fact that during that time in the Soviet Union, and I think a lot of people nowadays can relate to this, is that everybody in the Soviet Union at that time knew that the system that they had going wasn't working, right? Like the people at the bottom, the workers, knew that it wasn't working. They knew that the system was corrupt.
The vibes were off.
Yeah. They knew that the bosses were looting the system. Mm-hmm. They knew that, that the people at the top didn't really have any actual solutions for them, for the workers to make conditions better. Everyone knew from top to bottom that the system was off, that it wasn't quite working. But at the same time, no one really knew what a better alternative actually looked like. Mm-hmm. And because no one actually had a better vision for what the world could be like or what a better system could be like, instead, their leaders and the people that are in the Soviet Union, they just kind of normalized all of these things that were definitely not normal, right? So at the time,
They made it seem normal. They told you it was normal.
Made it seem normal, right? Yeah. So at that time, that would be like rampant corruption. That would be like a failing economic program, famine, disease, other political strife. And I think right now we have a very similar situation where...
I was going to say, it sounds like...
sounds
familiar.
I could be describing the United States, at the present moment, right? But, right now it's like we're expected to believe that like, having billionaires at the presidential inauguration is totally normal, or that, having the richest man on earth come in and promote government efficiency is something that's totally normal, or even having, masked ICE agents coming into our communities and kidnapping people is a totally normal thing to do. And I think a lot of people realize that it's not normal. I think a lot of people feel that instinctively.
Yeah.
But again, it kind of comes up with this reality that people don't really have a coherent vision
Right.
for what something else could be. So the net result of that is that I think a lot of people end up just feeling like they're kind of going crazy a
Right.
little bit. Like I feel like they see the things dipping into fascism, they see things getting bad, but at the same time, there's a lot of people in our lives who just kind of keep things going, right? They
Yeah.
don't really seem to acknowledge, or at least they seem to be turning a blind eye to a lot of things that are happening. So that, in a nutshell, that's hypernormalization. I will say there's a really good BBC documentary by the same name, Hypernormalization,
Okay.
by Adam Curtis. That
Worth a watch.
Yeah, it's definitely worth a
Okay.
watch, and it specifically kind of talks about hypernormalization within the kind of Western American context.
And a lot of the things you described are, related to right now, especially
Yeah.
within the Trump administration in the United States. When I heard you describing hypernormalization, I thought about the climate crisis as well.
Sure.
One of the things that I think feels hypernormalized to a lot of people is this idea that the planet keeps getting warmer. It's not even just about the temperature. It's not even just the carbon in the air. It's also biodiversity is dropping significantly.
Yeah.
Like the oceans are acidifying.
Yeah, I just saw a thing that bees are like dying. On
Pollinators are
speed,
disappearing.
Right? Yeah.
And we hear this in the
Yeah.
news that the glaciers are melting. And we also know that it's the way our economic system is set up that's causing that.
Yeah.
It's the
Yeah.
fact that the economy as it grows is creating pollution, is creating these problems.
Yeah.
It's causing deforestation. It's causing emissions of CO2.
Yeah.
And we're all implicated in that in many
Yeah.
ways.
Yeah.
Almost everyone is in a job that probably contributes in some way to that problem.
Sure.
But we just keep doing it.
Yeah,
And-
it feels inevitable. I mean, we're taught to make it seem like it's inevitable, and it's interesting you bring out capitalism. I mean, this kind of goes into one of the effects of living within capitalist society, which is what's called capitalist realism. I don't know if you've ever heard of that term. But
Yeah,
it's-
Mark Fisher.
Yes, Mark Fisher is a great book on that. But it's, for anyone who doesn't know, it's a philosophical concept that basically states that there's this air, this feeling in capitalist society that the only type of civilization that is viable or possible or makes sense is the system that we have now, right? So that's like Margaret Thatcher saying that there is no alternative, right? That's like Francis Fukuyama saying that this is the end of history. It's the idea that like liberal capitalist society, what we have now, is all there can ever be. And that, I think, leads to kind of what you're talking about, right? Where it's like this feeling of inevitability. You see all these problems happening, but no one's actually willing to take like the radical steps necessary to really think differently about how do we structure our societies? How do we think about value, right? Like how do we think about the function of money within, or capital within like global economy, and what that actually means on a macro scale.
It's this idea that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism.
Yeah,
That's the quote I often think about when I
Exactly.
think about capitalist realism. It's like we can't even. I think it actually is easier. We have movies about the end of the world.
Yeah.
We're all like, oh yeah, I could imagine the
Plenty
world
of movies
ending.
about that.
Yeah,
Right? Plenty
I
of
can
movies
imagine the
about the end of the world.
apocalypse, but I
Yeah.
can't actually imagine like the capitalism ending.
Well, that kind of goes into it too, right? I mean, it's like it's our pop culture influences that as well.
Yeah.
It's just as you say, like you'll see plenty of sci-fi movies about the end of the world, the giant laser from the sky blowing everything up. But yeah, you'll almost never see like what is an actual optimistic, viable alternative option presented within our media. Like that's usually never talked about.
Right.
And usually, when it is kind of like when there is critiques of capitalism, usually what you'll see as a critique of capitalism within media isn't necessarily a critique of capitalism in itself, but more so like a critique of like a bad actor within the capitalist system, right? It's like that one greedy mad scientist that tries to do something that is going to end the world, as opposed to like the fact that the mad scientist even exists in the first place.
Right,
You know what I mean?
right. Yeah, and I think that we sometimes do that in the anti-capitalist discourse and in leftist conversations of we paint a picture of these billionaires, which billionaires definitely are part of the problem, and certain ones of them are particularly bad actors. But it's also, I think, a deeper question is like, why are there billionaires? What is the system that created these billionaires? And the system that imbued them with so much power, right?
Yeah.
Because ultimately, the only way to prevent loud birds around, the only way to prevent someone like Elon Musk from having so much power is to ask, how did we get here?
Yeah.
And should this even be possible? And if
Yeah.
you ask those questions, you start to get to alternate ways of envisioning how a society could work.
Yeah, definitely. And it's reframing, because in the Western, especially American context, capital and power are very closely related, right?
Yeah.
So it's like the more property you own, the more capital you have. That basically means you have more power in society. And I think there are a few examples of like the alternative in some ways. Like if you look at what China has done in like recent years, they went through a very big campaign to try to rein in the power of like the tech billionaires that exist within China, right? So they have like people like Jack Ma, who founded Alibaba, and as well the founder of Tencent. I'm forgetting his name right now. But they amassed massive amounts of wealth creating these digital platforms, not too unlike Mark Zuckerberg or like Elon Musk or something like that. They were innovators within their own space. They became billionaires within their own space. And then what we saw happen in the last 5 years was that China has tried to rein in their power, right? Like because the China Xi Jinping's administration recognized that they are kind of gaining an undue amount of influence over politics. The Chinese philosophy being that capital serves politics, not the other way around, right? So that's, we've seen some countries kind of take steps to try to rein that in a little bit. But I think with America and American history, and especially just like the American philosophy as it is now, that's probably something that seems like completely egregious and like would never, there's like zero political will to do that here.
Right.
But
maybe right here there's a little bit of political will between us.
There's just no power. I don't have the power.
In this backyard, I feel the will is strong.
Yeah, plenty of will, zero power. You got to have both. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, I'm happy to yap about it, but I gotta, if someone could give me like Xi Jinping's power, then maybe I could try to do
We'll
that.
get there.
Yeah.
We'll get there, and we will actually get to what can we do about this.
Sure.
Before we do, though, I wanted to touch on one of the things you said about the Soviet Union and hypernormalization, and how it was very difficult to imagine something better, something different. And I'd love to just spitball for a minute on like what, in the United States context especially, which is where we happen to be, the arena in which we are working and fighting, for better or worse, what would a better future actually look like? Part of the reason I do this show at all is to kind of try to paint that picture and try to give people tangible things to do to move in a better direction. So I guess, when you think of what better would look like, what comes to mind?
There's a few different ways that you can approach that, I think. Are you kind of going to go from the kind of like better for the world angle, or are you going to kind of come at it from like maybe better for American society? Because I think sometimes those can be two different angles.
Yeah.
Mainly because if you think about like the position that America is in right now, the vast amount of wealth that we have accumulated, it is because America has been an imperial hegemonic power for the last, 50, 60 years, right? So with that comes a lot of extraction, a lot of subjugation, oppression of, global majority countries. So when we think about, what could be a better world for humans holistically around the world, part of that ultimately is probably going to be some level of, America kind of relinquishing some of that imperial control, that hegemony that has existed, which invariably will mean that, maybe the comforts and the luxuries that we're used to here in America may not be as easily accessible to everybody, right? So, like, I think we have to understand that as Americans, we are extremely privileged in that sense, in terms of just the amount of wealth that we have access to.
This is often a topic in climate conversations as well, of like, if we were to emit less, that means a lower standard of living. And I want to actually just nip that in the bud, because I don't believe in that narrative.
Well, I don't think standard of living necessarily correlates to luxuries. You know what I'm saying?
Exactly.
Like, I think you can have a good standard of living without having like a new iPhone every year.
Exactly.
You know what I'm saying? Like,
because it might mean we don't all get a new iPhone every year,
and that's fine.
But like, is that really making us happy? A lot of the recent research that's gone into what actually improves your standard of living has shown that over about $20,000 per capita GDP,
Yeah.
increased economic growth doesn't actually improve happiness or well-being, which begs the question of like, what are we doing this for anyway?
Sure.
The U.S. per capita GDP is in excess of $60,000 per person, way above that $20,000 threshold. And most people I know in the U.S. aren't thriving.
Yeah. Well,
You know?
I mean, I believe in that statistic, if you take off the top 1% of earners, I think that number goes down to about 30,000.
And that's where
So that's kind of where
that's where I think the math starts to make sense in terms of the quote unquote standard of living going down in a better future. Is like, well, probably not for everyone, but you probably can't have a private jet. You definitely can't have a yacht in that world. There's probably limits on the amount of consumption that one person can make.
Yeah.
And I think when I start to imagine that world, it's probably a world where billionaires don't exist.
Yeah.
It might not even be legal to be a billionaire. And I think people freak out at that and they say, oh my gosh, that's incredible amount of state overreach. It's like, well, it doesn't mean that people can't build businesses. It just means that taxes might work differently, such that if you reach a certain income threshold that we as a society democratically have agreed is the most amount of money one person actually needs.
You've won capitalism.
You've won.
You've beat the game.
You won the game.
You got to the end.
Yeah, exactly.
Congrats. Yeah,
then,
totally.
There are other ways to compensate people for a job well done in capitalism.
Yeah, absolutely.
For example, a statue.
Or a statue.
Or a building.
A firm
like it doesn't
pat
need
on
to
the back.
be
You know what I'm saying?
$3 billion more dollars.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think fundamentally what you're pointing out is like it's a values thing, right?
Exactly.
Like it's a values thing of like capitalism as an ideology. Like capitalism has evolved past, I think, just an economic model into its own ideology, right? And I think that has tainted a lot of the kind of like communal necessity of like the idea that we're all need to rely on each other, like ultimately, right?
Yeah.
And in capitalism, especially in like the Western capitalist, like neoliberal sense, like our need for community has been replaced with consumerism. And
100%.
That's where it leads to like rampant consumerism. When we need community, we got to pay for a gym membership or pay for, this club or that club or this yoga class or whatever.
If you have
like,
a problem, you're paying a company
everything's
to solve
behind a paywall.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? Like you don't own anything. Everything's just like behind this gate. But it doesn't actually have to be that way, especially if we just shifted our values to be much more communal.
Right.
So, I mean, I think obviously that's a tall order, but I think that's, definitely a part of it. Because if you look at like Nordic countries or something like that, where they are kind of participating in a socialist experiment, those values are very different. They have like a 50, 60% tax rate on their top earners, and they don't look at that as theft, right? They don't look at that as like, how could you be taking?
It's a way of contributing to the collective good.
It's a way of contributing, exactly.
And just to sorry to nerd out on you, but just to get back to the economic studies, like this recent paper into the state of post-growth economics and well-being economies, which are things that I love to study. They talked about how there's a GDP threshold and an income threshold per person at which lifestyle doesn't really get better.
Yeah.
They also looked into what does improve human well-being. And the answers were there were many answers, but the number one thing was actually just strong human relationships, which is a academic way of saying bonds with your community.
Yeah.
And it lines up with that famous Harvard study that they did of following people from like their college years all the way until they became 70, 80, 90 years old and tracked a bunch of metrics and figured out. It's like one of the, if not the best study ever conducted on like what makes people actually happy.
Interesting.
At least in the United States. Mm-hmm. And turns out the people who consistently were happier later in life had strong friendships.
Yeah.
That was the one thing that statistically significantly affected their happiness late in life.
Yeah.
Was, do they have strong bonds with other people?
Yeah. I mean, that reminds me of another study I read where like I think they surveyed people like what the most common last regrets were. And the most common one I believe that they talked about was not spending more time with family. right? It's like,
Yeah.
I wish I would have spent more time with family. I wish I would have spent more time with friends. I wish I would have taken more time to relax and enjoy life or whatever. It's almost never, I wish I had more money.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah. And you know, but I get why people in our current society focus on making money, because it feels like you need money for everything. And it doesn't necessarily feel like you can just ask your friends or family for help or ask your neighbors for help.
Yeah,
because that's just not the way things are structured. And so there are structural reasons for this, but ultimately, I think what we can do to shift the culture is to shine a light on what a different way of living could look like.
Yeah.
And the studies seem to confirm everything we're saying, which is, you know, make enough money to take care of your basic needs and then build a community around you that is there for you when you need help.
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of goes into, you know, what's nice is that there's I feel like a lot of people who are on that same kind of wavelength as you. Like, I feel like there's a lot of people who recognize the need to be more communal. And like that kind of living was how humanity was, right? For like the majority of human existence was like, you know, leaning on each other, like it was a communal kind of group. And even, you know, if we look at like indigenous communities and things like that, like in places where the state has left people aside, or even like if you look at how the Black Panthers organized mutual aid programs, you know, people have been forming systems to fill in the gaps for, you know, centuries, right? And, you know, even today you have a lot of these cool initiatives like worker co-ops or, you know, time banks or, you know, local credit unions, things like that, that operate on a fundamentally different set of values, right? Values that are more in tune with mutuality, with solidarity. And it's part of a larger growing system, actually, that I've been studying more called the solidarity economy. And I think, you know, getting more involved in that, I think, is like super, super key, because it is a reminder that, like, you know, in the way that you're thinking, the way that I'm thinking, there's actually a lot of people thinking that, and there's starting initiatives that reflect those values. But the issue right now is that they're all separate services, right? Like you go to a credit union, you might go to like a worker co-op to shop for groceries, you might go to, you know, a time bank for, you know, a thing here and there, but it's not kind of like connected into a single system.
Right.
And I think I've been really excited about the solidarity economy and trying to just figure out like how to get more involved in that and get more other people involved in it to try to turn it into like this holistic system. Because the more that we can invest into that, then I think people will start to shift the culture. You know, I think people will realize that it's actually not that hard to lean on a community if you just connect with the people who already are on that same wavelength.
This is where the cultural element comes in, right? Of like, maybe instead of always looking for more convenience and more comfort and the better machines in your gym, like, isn't it kind of cool to contribute to a local community-owned gym where you actually have friends and like you can hang out, and maybe there's events on the weekend, and like, sure, it might not have as high of a ceiling, or you know what I mean? Like there are certain comforts that are purchasable in a capitalist economy that give preferential treatment, or maybe they give an advantage to companies with more money, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I will say there is something to be said about the market in this situation, I think. Like, not to sound like a libertarian, but like...
Are you a libertarian?
I am not, no. At least I don't think so. Anyway,
we'll find out.
Somebody will tell me if I am, I'm sure. But like,
I'll tell you at the end of this podcast.
Yeah, please. Like, scale of 1 to 10. But I think, like, you know, in the same way that like 10 years ago, like, companies did not give a shit about sustainability, and like it wasn't really a core value of like any company or any, you know, of really any fashion company or whatever. But then fast forward to today, and like it's almost like if you're launching something new, you almost like can't launch it without having something about sustainability. And that's because of like the cultural awareness and like the desire among people in our generation, especially, to want something that's like sustainable and has like actual ethical values attached to it. You know, to your point about shifting the culture, I just feel like the more people that can invest in the solidarity economy, realize that it's viable, and then that just shifts the culture of like, what do we look for in a company that we actually want to invest in?
It becomes the expectation.
It's fun. It becomes the expectation. And then that, you know, market dynamics, I guess, if you're a capitalist, like, should hopefully shift, you know, the types of companies that end up being viable. But ultimately, too, I mean, like, you know, the purpose of the solidarity economy is also to shift away from always needing capital, right? So I think if someone has like a viable free option that's like robust and like local, I think that I don't think it's that big of a leap to think people will choose that over having to pay like, 10, 20, $50 for a gym membership or something like that. Like I've been doing calisthenics lately just because I don't want to pay for a gym membership.
Nice.
It's like exercise without
you look
capitalism. Thank you. It's like exercise without capitalism, which I like, So it's like I hope, and I've seen more people kind of getting into that tip too. Because I think people are just frustrated with
having to spend money on every little thing.
Everything being behind
every little thing.
Paywall.
I was just researching how our electricity bills are all going up because of AI.
Dope. Great.
Everything's getting more expensive all the time.
Fantastic.
Well, just to play devil's advocate here, because I love the solidarity economy. I love the idea of more community-oriented things. And if we can shift the culture towards rewarding those types of businesses and seeking out those types of businesses, then, we've done our job. But I think a common response I hear from people who are happier with the way things are now is that if we have less of a quote-unquote free market and a less abundant flow of capital towards profit-driven companies, et cetera, that there will be less innovation. And I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, well, personally for me, I don't think capitalism is necessary to have innovation. I hear that line a lot. Like I hear people say that like capitalism is the greatest engine for innovation that we've ever had, It's like Red Scare propaganda. It's an interesting statement, but also like your sample size is one. You know what I mean? Like capitalism as it is today, or
it's
at
all
least
we've got.
It's the only system out there. So it's like, can you really say that is true when you have like literally nothing to compare that to? And in fact, like, if you look at like, I think about like the space race, you know what I mean? Like US versus Soviet Union being a communist country. They weren't capitalists, but they led the U.S. in the space race for most of the space race. Like we got to the moon first, like we put a person on the moon first, but like first satellite in orbit, first human in orbit, first animal in orbit, like first people to orbit around the Earth. Those are all like the Soviet Union did all those things first, right? Like we were actually lagging behind. So it's interesting to say that capitalism breeds innovation. Specifically because also if you look at like today too, where we're in like this sort of late stage capitalism, it's almost like the antithesis of innovation, I feel like, where it's like, I just saw this thing where like Uber's like releasing a new service where they're like, we're going to have people get picked up in specific locations in mass groups, and then they'll go along a predetermined path to another. It's like, so you mean buses? Like you invented buses. You reinvented buses.
Thank
you know
you,
what I mean? or like streaming, right? It's like you have streaming and then now they introduce ads and introduce bundles, and it's like, oh wait, now we're back at cable, and or even VR, even AI nowadays. It's like at a certain point, the purpose of capitalism is not to innovate more; it's to generate profit.
It's just to cut costs from things that already exist.
Those are different goals, right? Like you can, and in fact, also innovating is often very costly. Like when you think about R&D of like IBM, all these people that like really innovated like some of the core technologies that created the foundation for computers and stuff. Those are all extremely costly things to do. That's actually not good for business to be constantly researching, developing, doing all that stuff. Like if you truly just wanted to be good for business, you would actually not innovate and actually do what we see a lot of things happen, which is just make existing products shittier and more easily breakable and whatever, so that customers keep buying more and more from you.
There's a reason people say they don't make them like they used to. It's because products just actually get worse and worse.
They literally don't. I mean, that's why there's a word for it.
We have the same things our parents had, but they just break faster.
Yeah, I mean, have you seen like fridges from like the 60s? It's
They're
like
incredible.
The most insane features, pull out drawers and stuff. I'm just like, why don't we have that? This is crazy.
The space race example is a funny one too, because the space race on the U.S. side was like one of the more socialist programs we had in that era. It was like a government-funded. NASA is a government-funded entity. It was the state that was doing all of that research and development.
Yeah,
and it was the government that created all of this new technology that eventually got privatized and ended up in our iPhones and ended up in our Wi-Fi mesh networks and things like that. Yeah. But ultimately, none of that technological advancement would have happened without a relatively quote-unquote socialist approach of the state directing funding into specific scientific targets that we were trying to hit as a country.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think it's a really good example, actually, of what government investment should look like.
Yeah.
Which is that's where innovation really comes
I
from.
wish we could get back to that time, man. Like, I feel like the U.S. has not really had a project like putting a man on the moon. That like a project that can really inspire like an entire generation. Like I just think about what it must have been like to like be on watching TV and like to actually see like a man land on the moon. Like that must have been
very inspiring.
Crazy to think about like what humanity is actually capable of. And I will say like when people say like capitalism equals innovation, I think they're equating capitalism with competition, which I also think is a misnomer, right? Because capitalism, you can have competition without capitalism. Like competition has existed since the dawn of time, pretty much, right? But capitalism is like a relatively...
I thought it was the British who invented competition.
The British? Yeah, probably. Or they're just taking credit for it.
The feudal lords.
Yeah, they're taking credit for it. Well, but it's like, you know, you can have competition without capitalism. I mean, and capitalism just being an economic model that, you know, rewards a hoarding of resources, essentially. Right. And, you know, that's kind of goes back into like the capitalist realism kind of thing, right? Where like the word capitalism kind of gets equated with all these other concepts that aren't really, not really capitalism, like competition, like innovation, things like that, that existed long before capitalism was ever thought of by Adam Smith.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned, you know, what if we had another space race or another moonshot program or something like that? And the guest before you on the show was the executive director of the Sunrise Movement, Aru, and she and her organization are trying to basically position the climate crisis as that thing, right? Like, what if solving climate change is the new massive moonshot-style social goal?
Yeah.
And we just throw everything we've got at it, and what could that look like? And it's actually a very inspiring thought exercise, because ultimately the amount of work that needs to be done to solve the climate crisis, especially by the U.S., which is the leading creator of the climate crisis, is an incredible amount of effort and work. It has to do with massive investments into renewable energy and nuclear energy potentially, and like complete transitions of an entire industry of oil and gas into new types of work, whether that's building geothermal energy because they actually happen to be really good at mining and drilling. And like huge infrastructure projects of new forms of electricity distribution around the country. It's actually a really massive amount of work.
Absolutely.
And that's the type of thing where, you know, people talk about, central decision-making authority being bad, centralized decision-making. Well, to solve such a big problem, you actually need a system-level view of what's happening and figure out, okay, where do we invest in different states and regions? And that actually requires some level of centralized analysis and decision-making. It doesn't mean that you have one dictator making all the decisions, but it is like a scientific approach that I think, to me, draws parallels to what NASA did with the Moonshot project. So I hope that we can start to think of the climate crisis as a collective problem that requires a big societal level solution, as opposed to let's just wait for an entrepreneur to come up with some sort of like CO2 sucking vacuum. Because one, that hasn't happened yet; it's getting pretty late, and two, that the private sector is not actually capable of solving such a big problem.
Yeah. Well, I think the private sector, the time horizons of a private business is usually very, very short, right? It's usually like 5-10 years or something like that. While the climate crisis is a much bigger problem. Though you know what it is though? I feel like if you reframed the climate crisis and gave it some sort of like nationalistic spin,
we need a new
word.
Like
then you would probably, or just like brand it in some nationalist way, like because like NASA, you know, they got that funding because it was like, we got to show it to the Soviets, you know. So it wasn't because they just loved space; it was because they hated the Soviets. Like, unfortunately, that's like America's motivation for everything. Is like you just have to like really hate somebody, and that's why you're just doing shit out of spite, basically.
How do we make it like an us versus like, them thing?
Yeah, if we can kind of be like
into solving climate change.
Yeah, it's like trying to redefine like what is an actual American value. Yeah, you know what I mean? Like, is it American to just like extract as much as possible and just say fuck you to the rest of the world? Yeah, or is it actually American to actually care about your fellow man and like want to create a world that your children are actually excited to live in, you know?
That's a big one, and I think it reflects back on the current political situation in the U.S., where there are many movements within the left, and people seem a little bit hyper fixated on the one that they care the most about sometimes.
Sure.
And I also think, to your point, it's like there is some infiltration that has happened by the CIA or others who have fanned those flames of trying to sow internal divisions between factions of the left. But ultimately, we struggle to build coalitions, and I think it's because we're all focused on small pieces of an overall problem.
Sure.
You've talked a lot about how every struggle, whether it's related to human rights or climate or racial justice, is linked to Palestine.
Yeah.
And especially in the current moment of history that we're in, where it's such a egregious and extreme problem that is on top of most Americans on the left's minds. I wonder if you can speak to that a little bit, just in terms of how those things are all connected.
Yeah, well, this is kind of goes into why I think at least part of why I think many pro-Palestinian people are so passionate about Palestine, is that we don't really see it. We don't see Palestine as an isolated issue. We see it kind of as a manifestation of almost all the kind of social issues that we face. Like, you can kind of imagine like Palestine is like the mushroom, right? But it's like when you see the mushroom, there's already like all this mycelium and stuff under the surface. Palestine is kind of like the most egregious example. And you can kind of come at it from a lot of ways. Like, you talk a lot about the climate, right? In the climate, in just the first 3 months of the genocide, the bombs that Israel dropped on Gaza accounted for the same carbon emissions as 26 different countries combined, right? And that was just in 3 months. This has been going on for nearly 2 years now. And that's not even including, right, the ships, the planes, the surveillance drones, like
bombs.
All the various things, just literally just bombs. And that's just bombing Gaza. Also consider that Israel has also been bombing Syria, Lebanon, now Iran, all these different places. So that's all part of it. And then we also have to think about, too, that nothing in this kind of globalized world that we are all existing in happens in a vacuum. Everything is connected in one way or another, because we are all part of a single global capitalist system. So when you think about the occupation in Palestine, Israel has managed to turn their occupation into a very profitable business. The Israeli military-industrial complex is one of the largest industries in Israel. They account, when it comes to weapons exports, they are right up there with the United States. And they're exporting their weapons to authoritarian governments. Mainly, many authoritarian governments use Israeli spyware. Previously it was called Pegasus. Now they're using, American police are using software called Cobwebs or Celebrite. Those are all Israeli pieces of spyware that were developed on Palestinians. It was tested on Palestinians first, and then they're sold on the open market as quote unquote battle tested, right? So.
Dark.
It's super dark. And then you think about immigration, right? A lot of the technology that reinforces and enforces the border around Gaza is created by Elbit Systems. So that includes like surveillance towers, that includes drones. Those same surveillance towers are present here on the U.S.-Mexico border as well. Like Israeli drones are being used to surveil the Mediterranean Sea to keep migrants from migrating into Europe. So, and if you want to think about human rights, about the Black Liberation Movement, about LGBTQ rights, a lot of the people that subjugate those protesters, those people organizing for those rights, so that's like police, private prisons, all these things, they are all also being trained often by Israel in exchange programs. U.S. police are often part of exchange programs with Israel to learn Israeli techniques. As well as using their technology. And one fact I like to point out is that like the kneeling technique that killed George Floyd was an Israeli technique. That came from Israel, So when we think about Palestine, it touches all of our lives in a way that's a lot closer than a lot of us think, I think. And the more that we can realize that, the more we can kind of come to a synergy of our movements, where we realize, because I think what happens a lot of the times is that there's this feeling of like, well, if you win, then I don't win. Right? It's like if you get more, that means I'm getting less. It's this kind of like scarcity mindset towards like liberation. Like we're kind of taught that like freedom is like this zero-sum game, when actually we're all part of the same system. We're all victims of the same system. And the more that we can kind of unite around that, we can all win together.
Yeah. The point you made about surveillance is one I want to double click into, because
Sure.
that's something very top of mind for me
Yeah.
during the Trump administration, especially in light of the partnerships that they're making with Palantir.
Yeah.
And something that I think worries me and probably should worry all of us is the military cooperation between the U.S. military and the IDF, and then the data level cooperation between the U.S. government and Palantir, and probably a quite likely scenario, which is some sort of data sharing between Israeli intelligence and U.S. intelligence.
Absolutely.
And that starts to get pretty scary.
That's already happening, by the way. That's definitely already happening.
Very likely already happening, and very likely getting closer and more synergized. And I think that should concern all of us, because when you have ultimately a foreign country that has an intelligence operation that is crawling the internet for anti-Israeli sentiment,
Sure.
Including social media, including anything that gets said and recorded and picked up by any of Palantir's data farming and big data, equipment. And then you have lists of people, probably on names and faces on servers in Israel, of people who have spoken out against the genocide in Palestine.
Sure.
Then you could imagine a world in which the U.S. government has flags on your individual identity and name within our government systems that are basically flags from the IDF's data that says this person has been an activist on an issue that we don't like them talking about. Therefore, when they come into the country, we're going to ask them questions.
Yeah.
When they submit their taxes, we're going to audit their taxes. When they file paperwork, we're going to double check it.
Yeah.
And it becomes a world in which you can get effectively punished or surveilled by the U.S. government for something that you said about Israel.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is not a world I want to live in.
Yeah.
But it
for sure
seems to be the dimension we're in now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely the direction that we're heading. I mean, Palantir has a long relationship, an existing relationship with Israel already. They've been supplying a lot of their technology, their AI technology, in support of Israel's operations. So that's already a relationship that's happening. And I do think, Trump has recently announced wanting to create this giant database where it collates people's Medicaid and tax records and everything. I think that speaks to kind of the
That's what I'm talking
full
about.
evolution of the police state.
Yep.
And that certainly spells is not a good sign for anyone who wants to be an activist or wants to speak out in any meaningful way. But that is certainly I think the direction that we're moving in. And that is the system that they have and already existing in places like Israel and even arguably China and everything. It's full on surveillance that you're not getting away.
It makes me think about China and the stories of how they assign a score to every citizen.
Sure.
And that being the worst nightmare of conservatives in the U.S. who point to China as
the social credit score thing?
Yeah, exactly.
That was a little bit blown up by American media, but I mean, we kind of do the same thing. It's just called a credit score here. But you can't do shit if you have a bad credit score.
Right, true. We do the market decides here, right? And the market is just a cartel of
it's
three
like
insurance
three companies.
companies.
Yeah, basically. Yeah.
The reason I bring that up is not necessarily that I believe all the stories about the score in China, the score system in China, but more that it is those people who do believe those stories, who are on the right in the U.S., who are actually, I think, starting to get really freaked out by what the Trump administration is doing with Palantir. And that actually gives me a glimmer of hope that says, oh, actually, there is a anti-authoritarian streak that runs throughout the left-right divide in America. Mm-hmm. And it's actually about the people versus the authoritarian surveillance state. And that is the type of energy I think we need to stop this from happening, because it's a very undemocratic process. To your point, the Trump administration doesn't seem to care what the people think, but if we're going to stand up and stop it, it needs to be more than just freedom-loving leftists who fight. It needs to be freedom-loving people in the world who stop this from happening and stand up. And ultimately, if there are enough of us, it doesn't really matter what data they have, because how do you stop 200 million people who all agree eventually the floodgates burst, right? Because there's just too many of us who are on the same page.
Yeah, I mean, that's the hope, I think.
If they can corner a small group of activists,
Yeah.
then that becomes a really scary world. But if it's a world where all of us actually are trying to fight the power and fight for freedom, then it's like, okay, well, actually strength in numbers does really seem to work in this kind of surveillance oriented future.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of goes back to the idea of the consent of the governed. I mean, I think that's why I try to make as many people as I can realize that it's not a left or right issue, right? Like none of these issues are left-right issues. They're top-down issues, right? It's working class versus ruling class. And I think it speaks to what you're saying, where if we can kind of get people on that page, then I think, we definitely have a lot better of a chance. And the one thing I will say, though, is that, like, I do think the creation of the police state, the creation of the surveillance state, it is a dual-party project. Like, I don't think it's like a Trump administration thing. I think he's certainly being the most vocal about it and the most visible about it. But I think, ICE was founded in 2003 under George W. Bush, given more money under Obama, given more money under Biden, given more, what I mean? So it's like,
these
these
not
things
simply
are
a Republican problem.
These things are kind of dual level problem. Both parties kind of have an authoritarian streak to them.
This is the deep state. And I think Trump did such a good job coining that phrase and making it seem like he was going to fight it. He's clearly just giving money and power to the deep state. He's not draining the swamp at all.
Isn't it funny that, like, Republicans used to be like the party of small government, and now they're like full on the biggest government possible? They just want full...
Well, they have the narrative worked out to where they cut the parts of the government they don't like, and then they massively strengthen the parts of the government they do, the parts of the government that work for them. And so they can hide behind this government efficiency narrative because they are cutting stuff. They're cutting stuff that keeps people alive in other countries, like USAID.
Yeah.
But then they're giving massive contracts to the surveillance part of the deep state.
Exactly.
And the military and ICE and the National Guard and basically the militarized police force that's gonna come knock on our doors when we say something they don't like.
For sure. I mean, I think we have to view that within the context of all the other existential crises that we face, right? Like climate change, potential nuclear war, AI, all these things. To me, I've come to the conclusion that the solution from our leaders for all of that is the police state, right? Like, I think when we look at all the funding that they're putting into police, the cop cities that are kind of popping up all over the country, and everything like that, I think we have to view that within the context of them also being aware of all the problems that we face, right? Like, they're not stupid. They have all the information that we have, probably more. And they know that, once massive migration happens because of climate disaster or nuclear war breaks out or whatever, that there's going to be massive unrest in response to that.
Yep.
And their solution for that massive unrest, rather than kind of changing the economic model or changing their ways, is actually the police state and the surveillance state. And that's kind of why it's been this dual party project, I think, for so long, because they know, I think, what's on the horizon, because it's inevitable. If you look at history, it happens every time,
It's like the solution is just strengthen. We've got another guest, a squirrel this time.
Squirrel.
Did a backflip right there. Wow. Their solution is strengthen the police state, increase control, rule with an iron fist, and prepare for the worst by controlling the situation.
Exactly.
Which is why I think our work is so important to shine a light on a different path forward.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
And so that different path forward would look like a more abundant future where all of this money and power, instead of going to a handful of authoritarians and a handful of billionaires, it's actually getting shared by the wider community who has real networks of support that don't require corporations to solve every one of our problems. And so I would love to maybe, start to steer this towards a bit of a sorry, this squirrel is coming right around the back of our...
It's got something stuck to his butt.
Yeah. That's funny. It's so cute. I'd love to talk a bit about what people can actually do to help bring that better future
for sure
to fruition. because clearly there's a lot of work being done to build a future that we don't want to see, which is environmental collapse, increased authoritarianism, increased militarization, cracking down on the movement of people and the freedoms of people. But there is stuff that all of us can do every day to start to lay the bricks for a different future. And I think that it makes me think of a lot of the work you do around community organizing, both here locally and in terms of the digital education that you do around what people can actually do as more conscious citizens of a better future. And so I'm curious, like, what you would encourage people who want a better future to come about to do, to have agency in right now, today, or next week.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's so many different ways, and this is kind of what I try to tell people is I think our view of what like resistance and protest can look like is kind of very narrow just because of pop culture. But I think what I always try to emphasize is that like regardless of what your access level is, what your skill level is, what your profession is, there's always a way to kind of get involved. When it comes to like systemic change, I like to think of it in three different parts. So one part is the solidarity economy, trying to build kind of like alternative economic models that we were talking about. And also there's the legislative route, trying to gain power within like the legislative government. And then there's also grassroots community building and kind of grassroots resistance. So I think, a good first step for anybody is to really take stock of like themselves and what they like to do, who they are as a person, what skills do you have, and see how you can, and use that kind of as like your way in. Like if you are somebody who is able to kind of go out, likes to talk to people, you can knock on doors, like maybe the grassroots route or even the legislative route. Maybe you run for office or something. Maybe you're a good cook, right? And you want to just like help participate in mutual aid and build up those systems and kind of more help your immediate community and your neighborhood. Or maybe you are the type of person where, you are able to be on the front lines and you can be marching every day. I think those are all valid routes to go down. But it's always good, I think the first step is kind of just take stock of where you are, take stock of what you can actually, what you think you can bring to the table, however small or large that is. Because I think one thing that we try to emphasize is that there's a lot of different roles and there's literally a role for everybody because we are building a new society here. So a society includes everybody, right? So that anybody has something to contribute. It's not always on the front lines either, right? Like at least from my experience, like a huge part of organizing is just like admin type work. Like it's literally just like managing group chats, updating spreadsheets, making sure that like everyone has the right information, is going to the right place. Like even being able to just do that, and that just requires a computer and like access to like a chat platform, is like huge. Like that makes things so much more efficient, and
massively helpful.
Massively need that. I'm glad you mentioned like the Conscious Citizens too, because that's a project that my studio Little Wind Studio started about 6 months ago. And it really is like a place that is meant for people who see the problems, who want to do something about the problems, but they're just like not sure where to start. And there we share two things. It comes in two parts. Like one is like a directory. It's an online directory where we're sharing education and resources and tools to help us build community power. And then it's also a newsletter where we're trying to talk about the issues that are happening, connect them to kind of like larger bits of history and other issues in the world, and provide more easy calls to action. And on there, we share a lot of different guides. Like we have one about like high impact ways that you can support your community during a crisis, right? Like,
oh, cool. It's all published there.
Yeah, it's all published there. And what we do is we curate from the internet, right? Because it's like we've realized that all the answers are actually out there on the internet.
Yep.
People have been doing this work for decades, long before I was alive. But the problem right now isn't a lack of information. It's actually too much information. And what we need now is actually curation. So that's kind of what we try to do at the Conscious Citizens, is we just try to curate all the best, most valuable stuff into one place and collect it into guides so that it's just more easily accessible for people who want to actually get involved in a day-to-day way. So we have like, if you're going out to a protest, there's high-risk protest safety guide that we have, ways that you can kind of support your community during a crisis. And we also have a whole guide on like ways to do direct action, right? Like ways to like set up a blockade or arrange a banner drop, or, to pass out flyers, or to do all these sorts of different tiny little actions that might not seem big on paper, but the point is, though, and this is another thing that I try to reiterate, is that we don't need everybody to be doing everything, right? We just need everybody to be doing something. So whether that something is tiny, like just calling your senator, calling your representative, or it could be really big, like trying to arrange a whole action. I think as long as you're trying to incorporate activism in some way into your lifestyle, that's going to be the best way forward. Because I think systemic change takes a long time. It's a marathon, it's not a sprint. And what's really going to allow us to have that longevity is to take like small conscious steps to incorporate community building, incorporate activism just into our day-to-day life, just like into our everyday lifestyles.
So it's not like a New Year's resolution where you do it for a couple weeks and you burn out. It's like, no, you actually just make it sustainable, make it repeatable.
Exactly.
And if it's global, national, local, there's kind of levels for everyone to get involved depending on your skill set. I love this idea of there being different roles and everyone's role is going to be different. I think that oftentimes we can get so overwhelmed by the weight of the world's problems that it feels like, well, I can't solve all of this, so I'm just going to kind of like dissociate and ignore it. Where it's like, actually, there's probably something that you are the only person that can do because you are in this place with this skill, with this perspective that is actually so valuable.
Yeah.
And it's not going to change the whole world, but you're laying a brick for the world that we're all building together.
Yeah, exactly. I think this kind of goes into, you probably heard about this because I think it comes from like a climate context, but the cathedral mindset.
Yep.
Like just the idea that like we may not see the fruits of our labor, but it doesn't make it any less worth doing. And that's something that I try to keep in mind a lot when I'm just like talking about this work or trying to encourage people to do this work, is that like we might not see the end of the road, but it's not necessarily about getting to the end of the road. It's just trying to create better conditions for the next person that we're passing the baton to.
Makes me think of the fact, what you learn in meditation is like you're never going to reach this point where you reach complete satisfaction with all of your life, but the journey is the destination.
Yeah,
the building of the thing is the thing.
Yeah,
right. And the participation of all of us is going to allow it to actually have the power that it needs to fight some of these other movements that are trying to build something different.
Yeah, and the best cure for feeling overwhelmed and feeling apathetic is to find community, right? It is to connect with people who actually feel the same way. We're so separated from our community that it does create this sense of apathy when you just see all the problems in the world and you're just one person and it feels like you're not doing anything or it feels like you can't do anything. But that is kind of the point, right? Is to have people feel that way. So then that way they're less engaged, right? That's why you have like all these apolitical people when in fact everything is political. I think it's partly because they want us to feel apathetic and that we are powerless. And one of the greatest solutions to that have helped me personally feel a lot better about what's going on and the work that's being done is getting more involved with community and just starting super local. Like if you're starting from nothing, then, talking to your neighbors, cleaning up your streets. I think like even small things like that can really just help you kind of get into this mindset of like, okay, maybe no one's going to ask me to do this, but I'm just going to do it anyway because I think it's a good thing to do. And I'm going to like start talking to my neighbors. I'm going to start getting to know the people in my community. And just doing that, I think it really just helps kind of re-add that human element to a lot of this stuff and kind of get it off of the screens,
Where can people find all of these guides that you've made?
Yeah. So everything, all the guides, all the resources is at theconsciouscitizens.org.
Okay. I'll link that down below in the show notes.
Thank you. And people can sign up for free. It's a totally free way to get access to everything in the directory, the newsletter. Everything is up for free. We don't believe in gatekeeping education or anything like that. Though, I mean, there is an option to, monetarily support if that's what you want to do, which we would very much appreciate. But yeah, theconsciouscitizen.org. It's all off of social media platforms, which I think is also really important. We also do have an Instagram called The Conscious Citizens that you can follow for more updates and things like that. And then I'm also always posting about this type of stuff on my own pages, so retrospectively on Instagram and TikTok. And then I also have a YouTube channel where I'm going to be posting more too, where I'm talking about all the same kind of stuff.
Hell yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Ray, thank you for being on the show. Really appreciate the work you're doing, both at a educational level for everyone who wants to be a part of this movement, and also for my neighborhood because we happen to be neighbors. Yeah. So I'm lucky to be your neighbor. Thank you. And look forward to continuing to follow your work and watch more of the great videos you put out.
Well, thanks for having me.
Of course, man. If you want to learn more about Ray's work and check out Conscious Citizens, I've put links in the episode description. So it should be super easy for you to go from here to their website. If you liked this episode and want to hear more episodes, please subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Substack. I've put links to all of those in the description as well. Sharing this episode with a friend is another super helpful thing you can do as I get this show off the ground. So if you know someone who you think would enjoy this conversation, please send it their way. Thank you so much for your support. And by the way, I'm super excited about the next episode. I really can't wait to share it with you. So stay tuned. Thanks for listening to Better Future, and I'll talk to you soon. Ciao.